Good morning. So, the title of my talk today is the veracity of experience. Veracity is a somewhat rare word, but it means truth, the truth of experience. The poetic dimension in architecture, as in all works of art, is constituted in its embodied encounter and experience. As John Dewey argued in Art as Experience in 1934, the artistic dimension of a piece of art or architecture exists only in its experience, both in the conception and later sensory encounter. That is why students of architecture should be made to experience real buildings and works of art in the material, environmental, cultural, and human contexts. Teaching through pictures tends to allure students to see the entire phenomenon of architecture visually, the world as a picture, to use an expression of Martin Heidegger, instead of confronting the essential relational and integrated interactions of architectural phenomena. The view of Dewey that architecture is constituted only in its moment of conception and recreation in experience is significant. Here I'm reminded of the ways through which some of the finest architects, from the masters of the classical era to Le Corbusier, Tadao Ando, and Glenn Murcutt, have learned architecture through traveling rather than formal education. Ideas of buildings are conceived through imagination with the help of drawing, models, commercials, numerical and verbal descriptions, and digital simulations. This is a sketching sheet by Alvarado. The presentation of an architectural reality calls for the ability to imagine, formalize, and communicate it in a manner that the projected entity becomes experientially real for others through the chosen mode of representation. Architecture is still mostly understood as an art of visual form, but in the lived life, environments, spaces, and buildings are encountered through all the senses simultaneously in an embodied manner and in full integration with the viewer's sense of existence and self. However, the design methods and media in the craft of architecture have evolved almost solely for visual communication. This tends to distort its relational and mediating role. This tends to distort the relational and mediating role of architecture and its fundamentally multisensory nature. Yet, in the design process, the mature architect conceives the designed entity intuitively and empathically as its imagined encounter through all the senses. Architecture is, of course, also encountered in books and publications through drawings, photographs, and verbal descriptions. However, this presents a serious reduction of its spatial, embodied and multisensory essence, as well as of the fundamental impact of moving through and in the spaces and inhabiting them. Movement is the deep structure of our of our sensory and bodily systems, to the degree that if the eye is momentarily immobilized in a laboratory test, the visual image disintegrates in a few seconds. The human eye has evolved to perceive the world in motion and also in twilight, not in overly bright illumination. We are thinking of architecture as an object, a substantive, but it is essentially a verb, a choreography and a suggestion and invitation to action. John Dewey even suggests that the human mind is a verb. The conception and experience of architecture call for stimuli simultaneously through all the senses, as well as the composite sense of existence and self. If we intend to extend our understanding of architecture beyond its visual domain, the methods and media in the processes of conception, communication, and education have to be decisively extended, altered, and sensitized. How architecture has been represented has reflected how architecture has been thought about. Still in Renaissance time, it was seen fundamentally as a mediation between the macro and microcosms, the gods and the mortals. Traditionally, architecture has also had a dialectical role in relation to nature and the man-made landscape. In the modern world, this mediating task has all but disappeared, as architecture has been regarded as autonomous visual and aestheticized objects, and as end products rather than a means for something more important beyond the built structure. As a consequence, architecture has turned self-centered, self-sufficient, and even autistic. A determining condition is how architecture is seen in relation to human perception, the senses, and the existential condition. The modes of architectural representation from the sketched notations of Michelangelo and Leonardo and the geometric constructions of Renaissance, all the way to today's computerized drawings, renderings, and algorithmic constructions, as well as 3D modelings, reflect the differences in the understanding of the essence of architecture. I have chosen to speak of the multisensory and existential essence of architecture as a ground for the discussion on how architecture can and ought to be represented. In addition to reflecting the basic understanding of architectural essences, the representations also reflect the very intentions of these representations, such as today's documents for technical, legal, economic, and publicity purposes, as opposed to mediating the experiential, sensory, and mental dimensions. Representations like metaphors are also internal mental tools or shorthand for the designer himself, herself. The complex processes of commissioning the design task, sketching and developing the idea, as well as the legal approvals, production and construction documents in architectural practices consist of successive phases through which the intentions and ideas of the client, architect, designer, other engineers, other experts, authorities, craftsmen, etc., have to be communicated, coordinated, and fused. This process includes visual sketches and drawings, verbal descriptions and definitions, numerical calculations and verbal specifications, as well as three-dimensional models of the intended architectural entity or its parts. During this process, countless functional, technical, aesthetic, material, as well as experiential properties and qualities are developed and communicated between the various players and participants. Finally, the design intentions have to be communicated to the builders and craftsmen. Throughout the process, the architect herself needs the means to concretize, develop, and represent the emerging ideas during the often long and arduous design process. Sir Colin St. John Wilson worked 35 years on the British Library in London. In the end of such a long process, the designer himself is a different person with altered views and values than in the very beginning. How can the process of thinking and representation guide the project through time and maintain consistency and continuity? Alvar Aalto pointed out the inherent complexity of all architectural design tasks as he wrote, "Whatever our task, whether large or small, in every case opposites must be reconciled. Almost every formal assignment involves dozens, often hundreds, sometimes thousands of conflicting elements that can be forced into functional harmony only by an act of will. This harmony cannot be achieved by any other means than art. The final value of individual technical and mechanical elements can only be assessed afterwards. A harmonious result cannot be achieved with mathematics, statistics, or probability calculus." End of Aalto quote. Here Aalto emphasizes the internal conflicts and oppositions and the central role of the synthesizing intuitive imagination. His view probably sounded disappointing in the post-war era that believed in reason, intelligence, scientific knowledge, and technology. Alvar Aalto used the philosophy of constant doubt instead of blind and naive confidence. Today, architectural design is increasingly seen as problem-solving, but I share Aalto's view. Architecture is too complex, layered, and internally conflicting in its very essence to be dealt with entirely rationally. I venture to argue that a complete theory of architecture is an impossibility. An action that fuses beliefs and visions, knowledge and imagination, rationality and emotion, aesthetics and science, can hardly be molded into a singular theoretical structure. Significant works of architecture are usually closer to personal confessions than results of rational and logical process. I'm often introduced as a theoretician. I'm not a theoretician. I'm working on personal confessions, as I'm saying here. The design task usually advances as an autopiloting, internalized, emotive and empathic action, which eventually concretizes and frames the possibilities as well as limitations of the task at hand. Questions and answers arise simultaneously in the design process. This is an important argument for me. Questions and answers are tied together in the design process. Questions are not presented before. A creative design process usually even redefines the brief. A successful architectural project does not only respond to the preconceived requirements as it creates its own goals, intentions, and qualities that no one could have seen in advance. In Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, the most enigmatic and memorable aspect is the sublime void of the courtyard opening towards the Pacific Ocean. This metaphysical void, one of the finest spaces in architectural history in my view, could not have been specified in advance by anyone, because it was brought about by the design process itself. And as it is well known, Luis Barragan had his impact on this empty space, or leaving it empty. Interplay of the senses. Throughout the modern era, the dominant role of vision has not been questioned. The valued position of vision in modernity is clear, and the senses that have been understood to have the least significance in architectural experience are touch, smell, and taste. This accepted view reveals the regrettable fact that more than half of our sensory modes have been marginalized in modern architectural thinking. Besides, our eyes have not evolved for bright light, as we are twilight creatures, but this biological fact has not been considered in contemporary architecture either. And these sensory realms have hardly been included in architectural theory, education, and practice. Additionally, the senses have mostly been studied in isolation from each other, and in the unnatural situation of the controlled research laboratory, rather than in the real impurity and essential interactions of lived life. Vision itself has been almost exclusively studied as a fixated, immobile eye, although that is a completely unnatural situation. Our eyes are constantly in motion, and when they are experimentally fixated, the image disintegrates. Besides, it is crucial to understand that we are not creatures that see, hear, touch, smell, and taste as separate and isolated sensations. We produce an integrated and polyphonic experience in our existential encounter with the world. The veracity of the real is fundamentally grounded on this multisensory essence of the existential experience. The senses interact, and we experience sensorially complete and integrated spaces, places, and situations. Our very reality sense, its plasticity, depth, and authority arises from the crucial interplay, layering, and fusion of the senses and the temporal dimension. Even neurobiologically, the integration of the senses is seminal. All sensory input interconnects at the brain stem, and how we feel, think, and act involves all the senses. We are not usually conscious of the complex nature of our experience, as we take the reality as granted and given. Yet, most of us have experienced, for instance, how a movie loses its feeling of reality when the sound is turned off. And we can test how alienating a purely visual world would be. The frightening and depressing character of a sudden visual experience has been commented by blind persons who have recovered their capacity to see and suddenly entered the visual reality and found it frightening and alienating. Maurice Merleau-Ponty describes the integration, completeness, and simultaneity of our sensory experience convincingly. Quote, "My perception is therefore not a sum of visual, tactile, and audible givens. I perceive in a total way with my whole being. I grasp a unique structure of the thing, a unique way of being which speaks to all my senses at once." End of quote. This philosopher has also introduced the suggestive notion of the flesh of the world to describe the lived reality of the world in which we are immersed. And he writes, "Our body is in the world as the heart is in the organism. It sustains it inwardly and with it forms a system. This is also the designer's sensory reality." The reality sense. Synesthesia is somewhat exceptional capacity of individuals to fuse two or more sensory realms, for instance, seeing musical sounds or entire musical keys as colors or vice versa. But provided our senses and neural systems function normally, we all experience the world as a sensory unity in a polyphonic manner. We do not normally distinguish individual senses, as they are all integrated in the existential experience, our sense of being. The reality sense in this layered sensory multiplicity. In opposition to the commonly accepted dominance of vision in architecture, I wish to suggest that the most important sense in the art of building is not vision in isolation, but the existential sense, our sense of being registered and communicated through all the senses simultaneously. I have now been writing 60 years, and my conclusion is that the most important sense in architecture is our existential sense. We experience places and spaces through our being rather than vision or any other sense in isolation. Architecture is an inseparable part of the flesh of the world It is a man-made extension of the flesh, but it is simultaneously an extension of both our physical and mental faculties. Architecture does not only provide physical shelter, as it extends our physical and mental faculties into the world. Besides, there is a definite tactile component in vision, and we unconsciously touch surfaces, materials, and temperatures through vision. Not surprisingly, Walter Benjamin regarded cinema and architecture as primarily tactile art forms in his visionary writings of the 1920s. Merleau-Ponty expands our visual touch to cosmic dimensions. Through vision, we touch the stars and the sun, he suggests poetically. The unconscious touch, concealed in and mediated by vision, is crucial for the feel and atmosphere of objects, surfaces, materials, and spaces. The hardness, uninvitingness, and lack of sensuality in much of contemporary architecture arises from the lack of visually transmitted touch and intimacy. There are likewise visual and tactile components in hearing. A space can appear acoustically soft or hard, intimate or repulsive, for instance. Vision mediates acoustical qualities as well as experiences of smells and tastes, and vice versa. As commonly understood, the significance of odors for taste is seminal in the art of cooking, but olfaction is equally significant for the reality sense in our daily experiences. The sensory fullness and comforting pleasure of walking through a forest or a natural field arises the multisensory richness of the experience reinforces its sense of reality and truth. But how can subtle and fused sensations be imagined and represented in design work? Reality, sense, and the flesh of the world. When being in a landscape, we are not looking at it from outside as a visual image, photograph or painting, as we do not feel like being in a visual space, and we do not feel like being in a visual space as we are as we are inside the space and situation, not looking at it from outside. Human existence is always constituted in specific space, place, and situation, not as an isolated and disconnected abstraction. Our experiences are always placed. This was already a truth that Plato verbalized. We are in the landscape through our whole being. We are in the flesh of the landscape. Experiences take place in the continua of perceived space and time, not as isolated fragments. The landscape and our sense of existence are fused in a singular experience of being and self. In this experience, all our sensations, including the consciousness of our body and its interior, our beings, feelings and moods, are united and fused. The multiplicity of sensations forms the reality of all buildings. Just try to think of a medieval cathedral without its echo, its cool air, the layered fragrance of centuries of burnt candles and incense, and the smell of stone that also suggests a distinct taste. The sense of an authoritative reality would be lost. Sitting on the pew in a church brings a taste to the mouth, which is in dialogue with the odors, materials, and visual stimuli. Marble, especially when polished, triggers a subliminal sensation of taste, and colored marbles bring a suggestion of a sweet taste to the tongue. Our real experiences are orchestrations of all the senses, and a sensitive architect imagines this orchestrated and polyphonic entity instead of merely the visual geometry. But how does he represent it? Sensing architecture. Tactile and acoustic sensations, as well as suggestions of smells and tastes, are also significant in the imagined reality sense of architecture. When reading a novel, we do not only project a visual image of the narrative as we experience the reality of the spaces and events. When reading a great literature, we create the settings with the sensory qualities in our imagination. In his novel, The Notebooks of Malte Lauritz Brügge, Rainer Maria Rilke gives a stunning description of the sensory qualities of the scarce signs of life, especially of odors, left of a demolished house on the end wall of the adjacent building. This is what he writes. There were the midday meals and the sicknesses and exhalations and the smoke of years and the stale breath of mouths and the oily odor of perspiring feet. There were the pungent tang of urine and the stench of burning soot and grey reek of potatoes and the heavy, sickly fumes of rancid grease. The sweetish, lingering smell of neglected infants was there, and the smell of frightened children who go to school, and the stuffiness of the beds of nubile youths. End of quote. Even tiny fragments of the building in the poet's description give rise to a forceful narrative of life through the collaged unity of subliminal, visual, tactile, and olfactory sensations. Similarly, we also hear spaces, materials, and surfaces. We hear entire villages and cities, and every city has its characteristic soundscape and odorscape. Rilke's description surely makes our sanitary and visually aestheticized images of architecture appear sterile and devoid of life. Quote, why is it that architecture and architects, unlike film and filmmakers, are so little interested in people during the design process? Why are they so theoretical, so distant from life in general? End of quote. Jan Vrieman, the Dutch filmmaker, asks. A great writer is able to mediate experiences of all our senses, including intestinal sensations of disgust, fear, suspense, nausea, evoked by the literary text. A touching text even evokes reactions in our skin, throat, breast, heart, and stomach. A master writer does not show us a snapshot of the scene, but she entices us to project a true multisensory experience around the imagined event and invites the reader to be part of the scene. We are not watching a scene, we are right there in the middle of it. Bohumil Hrabal, the Czech writer, points out the bodily concreteness of the literary imagination when he writes, "When I read, I don't really read. I pop up a beautiful sentence in my mouth and suck it like liqueur until the thought dissolves in me like alcohol, infusing my brain and heart and coursing on through the veins to the root of each blood vessel." End of quote. This account of a writer reveals how real and lifelike sensory stimuli evoked by literary imagination can be. Besides, these sensations are transferred from one realm to another, and even to the most intimate of our senses, smell, taste, and the interior of the body. In her book, Dreaming by the Book, Elaine Scarry explains the vividness of a profound literary text as follows, quote, "In order to achieve the vivacity of the material world, the mental arts must somehow also imitate its persistence and most crucially its quality of givenness. It seems almost certainly the case that it is the instructional character of the verbal arts that fulfills this mimetic requirement for givenness. This requirement for givenness also applies to architecture and other arts. An artistic work should appear natural and unconstrained instead of feeling fabricated and artificial. Similarly, a painting the mere visual representation in a painting, the mere visual representation does not suffice, and a great painting gives us a fully rounded sensory experience. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre writes, quote, "If the painter presents us with a field or a vase of flowers, his painting are windows which are open on the whole world," end of quote. In exactly the same way, good architecture is always also a world. Architecture is worlds, not buildings. Paraphrasing Paul Valéry, Merleau-Ponty suggests, Cézanne's paintings make us see how the world touches us. In my view, this is also the task of architecture. Buildings are expected to mediate between us and the world. The significance of touch. We are not aware of the fact that all our sense organs are modifications of the originary skin tissue of the fetus, and thus they are transformed modes of touching. As James Turrell, the light artist, has testified, we can all fairly easily learn to distinguish a few strong colors by the skin of our body, by the thin skin behind our arm and leg bends. He also speaks of tactile light. Light and sound waves can transport the visual and oral sensation long distances, whereas smell implies nearness and taste brings the object to our lips and the cavity of the mouth, eliminating distance altogether. Regardless of our beliefs, also the human olfactory sense is surprisingly accurate. We need only 8 molecules of substance to trigger an impulse of smell in our nerve ending, and we can detect more than 10,000 different odors. The sensations of the mouth are the infant's first contact with the world. This child's mouth contact with the world is called introjection in psychoanalytic literature. Touch itself is the intimate sense of being in physical contact, except when a tactile suggestion is mediated by the more distant senses of vision and hearing. The usual sensory coldness, hardness, and uninvitingness of contemporary architecture arises from its lack of haptic invitation and sensuality mediated by vision. And then I come towards the end of my talk. Our senses are either directional or omnidirectional and embracing. Vision is directional, and it separates us from the object, space, or situation that we are sensing, whereas sound and smell are omnidirectional and embracing sensations. We face the object of vision, whereas we occupy the space of sound and smell. Modernity has been obsessed with clarity of form and focused vision, which both promote exteriority and control, and the separation of the subject and the object. Peripheral vision has hardly been studied at all, although the medium of our spatial and existential cognition is peripheral vision. Due to its fascination with focused form, modernity has undervalued the other senses and failed to acknowledge atmospheres, feelings, and moods as real and significant architectural qualities. The fact that we have an identifiable and visible organ for each one of the 5 Aristotelian senses has further guided us to think of the human sensorum as being constituted of the 5 senses only. Yet, Steinerian philosophy categorizes 12 human senses: touch, life sense, self-movement sense, balance, smell, taste, vision, temperature sense, hearing, language sense, conceptual sense, and ego sense. The 6th Sense Reader, which is a book that came out about 12 years ago, lists no less than 34 systems through which humans are in interaction with the environments. So we might have over 30 senses instead of the 5 Aristotelian senses. In addition to the sensations of the 5 senses, our experience of reality includes sensations of gravity, orientation, temperature, air movement, placeness and time, as well as personal intentions, feelings of one's own body and inner organs, memories and dreams. We do not live in physical spaces. Our lived world fuses material reality, memories, and dreams. Reality is always a complex and dynamic mixture of sensations, bodily and mental components, which do not form a definite figure, pattern, or organization. In his recent book on atmosphere, Professor Tonino Griffero calls such phenomena quasi-things. The experience of atmosphere, feeling, or mood is a complex quasi-thing, which can have a decisive impact on our behavior, mood, and intention, although it does not possess materiality, form, or a conceivable structure. The atmospheric experience is immediate and involuntary, as we have a feeling of our environment, weather, and social situation without especially intending it. I enter a building, I see a room, and in the fraction of a second I have this feeling about it, Peter Zumthor confesses. And my last few sentences. The shift of attention from form to experience, from shape to atmosphere, and from visual impression to multisensory and fused encounter calls for a new design consciousness and methodology. Yet it is evident that as architects and designers, we need to grasp the essence of the entire human sensory reality and to sensitize ourselves to our neglected and nearly lost senses. Instead of focusing on form, we need to learn to sense, understand, and represent dynamic phenomena, movement, change, and becoming. Thank you.